All right, good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Walker, and I'm with the Lone Star chapter of the Sierra Club. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for our webinar, Keep Rivers Flowing, Innovative Strategies to Protect and Restore Rivers. This is our third presentation of a three-part series. Our goal of this series of webinars has been to explore what action is being taken to protect and restore rivers around the world, in the U.S., and here in Texas. Today we will take our focus across the world to learn about the historic Murray-Darling Basin Plan and how the Australians are keeping their rivers flowing. As we've said before, we hope to bring the best of what is happening around the world to Texas and explore whether these applications make sense for our state. We hope that you enjoy our program today. We have two very knowledgeable presenters today. First, we'll be hearing from Mike Young. Mike currently holds the Australia Chair at Harvard University and has played a key role in the development of the sharing and trading arrangements in Australia. While at Harvard, Mike has been working on a book on the design of water entitlement and allocation regimes and teaching a course on the design of transformational environmental policies. In Australia, Mike holds a research chair in water and environment policy at the University of Adelaide. Mike will be followed by Jennifer Ellis. Jennifer is with the National Wildlife Federation and is a senior project coordinator for the Texas Living Waters Project. Jennifer has been deeply involved in the development of environmental flow standards for several of our river basins and connected bay and estuary systems in Texas. As we move from the development and adoption of environmental flow standards to implementation, Jennifer and the entire Texas Living Waters Project team is focused on how to get water into our rivers and bays where it's lacking and how to keep it there when we have sufficient quantities available. We need to just go over a few logistics here. The webinar is going to be 60 minutes in length, and we have allocated 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. You can listen to audio through your computer speakers or via telephone. You can select either option through the control panel on the right side of your screen. And all of the webinar participants are muted, but we do want to hear from you. So please type any questions that you have during the presentations into the control panel located on the right side of your screen, and we will proceed as we proceed. We'll be monitoring those, and we're going to select several questions to hand off to Mike and Jennifer for the question and answer period, and we're going to attempt to answer others as we proceed. So I want to thank you for attending the webinar today. Let's go ahead and get started. We'll get Mike set up here to give his presentation. Let me switch control of the keyboard over to him. All right, Mike, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm an Australian, so please forgive my accent as I try and explain things that Australia's done to Americans. It's always a challenge to do that, but let's see how we go. Now, I've got a problem here. I can't change slides. That's better. Now I can, I think.
Can you see the little advanced option icons now, Mike?
But it's not working.
Okay, well, just let me, I will advance them for you. How about?
Okay, next slide.
Sorry about that.
Okay, the first lesson that really stands out in Australia is how suddenly things can get drier. And the graph you can see before is the graph of rainfall that landed in and around Perth in Western Australia, and below that stream inflows. Something happened in 1974, and we discovered that the system suddenly got much drier. If you click the button again,
Mike, you should be able to advance now.
I can, right, yes, I've got it. So if you notice in there, if there's a little green line that's going, a dotted line that's going back, since 1974, not once have we had what we used to think was the average rainfall in Perth. And it took Australia a long time to understand that sudden change can happen and it can be irreversible. And that's what's happened and driven a lot of the reform processes. The second lesson, which is equally important to understand, is when it gets drier, even if you lose half your water, as we had happen in Perth on average, the amount that's available for use goes down much more savagely, because you still need to keep rivers flowing and you still need some water for the environment. And that means that the hit that users take when you go into a long dry regime can be much more savage. And it was observations like this that really drove water reform in Australia and really made us think carefully about things. Australia, as you're aware, is the driest inhabited continent in the world, and around about the early 1990s it decided to turn its old antiquated water licensing system into a totally new, robust one. And the thing which we did, which is different to what you find in Texas, is we were prepared to contemplate totally changing the water rights that we had. A lot of people at the start were very concerned about that, but as we went into a decade-long drought with the bones of a new system in place, we emerged with an outstanding system which has really served us well. And if you talk to water managers in Australia now, they're confident that they'll be able to withstand droughts in the future, look after its environment, and ensure that it has minimal damage to its economy. What did we do? The story really starts 100 years ago when Alfred Deakin, the man who became Australia's first Prime Minister, came over and looked very carefully at the US prior appropriation system, the system you have in much of Texas, and wrote a report to Australia saying, don't adopt it. Go to a system which is based much more around what we would now describe as a sharing policy. 1994, we did what Texans have been very interested in doing, is we decided that as a nation we should try and use water to generate wealth without causing harm on the environment. And we started a journey of setting binding limits on use and doing what you describe as appropriating, or what we call closing catchments, and saying there'll be no more water rights issued. And in 1996 we put in a very brave move that said that there will be no restrictions on trade and no restrictions on who owned water. Initially, everybody was very frightened of that, but very quickly it started to generate a lot of wealth, drive a lot of structural adjustment, and start solving environmental problems. And in 1998, we even went to what was called an interstate water trading trial, and we allowed people to trade water within 50 kilometres of the South Australian border over into the South Australian border, and also in that region between New South Wales and Victoria. It was a radical trial and it worked, and so in 2000 we decided to do what's called unbundling, and I'll explain that quickly in a minute. But then we went into building the bones of what I call a really robust system. Then from 2002 to 2009 we had what's described as the Millennium Drought, which brought the importance of getting water management right to the forefront of every Australian, and water management became a national issue. So much so that in 2004 we set up a national water initiative to drive the reforms throughout all of the country. And then in 2008 we made another very important decision. We decided to set up an independent Murray-Darling Basin Authority and have a small board of 5 to make all of the major decisions around water management. And we began in buying environmental water and then put a plan in place. I mentioned unbundling, and I need to describe this as a very important process. One of the things we concluded early on was that we needed to allow water to trade, as it does trade in some parts of Texas. We went into really setting up what we call tradable permits. But then we went one step further and we decided to bring more levels of control into the system. So we issued what we call entitlement shares, which are defined uniformly in large areas, and then established a very bank-like accounting system where when water is allocated to shareholders, you can see it on a water account that looks just like your bank account. When water is added to your account, it's credited. As you use it, it's debited. When you transfer it from one person to another, it just comes off your account, goes on to another account. And that can all happen virtually instantaneously. And we allowed the carry forward of water. We took away a requirement for use, as you have in Texas for a lot of your water, and said people are allowed to use water or store it for another year or leave it for the environment. That simple change brought a lot more rationality into water and drove a lot of investments in efficiency. And then we separated out all the use controls as well. So we ended up with 3 and in some cases 4 or 5 systems sitting side by side. If you imagine a tank of water, and this might help people to understand what happens, we first of all in the new planning systems we have set aside water for conveyance, a base flow, and then we set a diversion limit, the maximum amount that can ever be taken. And we describe that amount as water to be shared. We set up 3 priority pools, high security water, which is priority number 1, general, and then low security water. And water is first allocated to the first third of the tank and then the second third as it becomes available. And it's fascinating to watch this happen. And what it means is everybody can plan as water comes in and becomes available. And it keeps on, the first pool's filled up, the second pool's filled up, and when there's a lot of water around, the third pool is set up. And if you think about this, this is a very, very simple system. We keep flood water set aside and is always managed separately because floods have a lot of legal liability issues. What happened when we did these things was fascinating. Trade took off very quickly as soon as we put a cap on the amount of water that could be taken from the system, and expanded. And while this was happening around about 2004, 2005, 2006, we started buying water for the environment and bringing the environment in as an equal shareholder. Previously, we'd always promised that the environment would come first, but when push came to shove, it always came last. So we decided to make it an equal shareholder. At first, irrigators were very nervous and very concerned about what would happen, but they became very interested as they realized the rate of return and the increase in the value of water rights. The graph in front of you shows the internal rate of return, essentially the annual profit that was made from holding a water right. And you'll see that it virtually never went below 15% per annum in the first decade of water reform from 1998 through to 2009. The line in red shows how much you could earn from holding shares in Australian shares just generally, but water became a very profitable investment, and suddenly irrigators became very interested in what was going on and very concerned that the reforms went right. The changes that happened were massive and quite exciting as we went forward. When the drought occurred and really started in 2002, one of the things that this open trading approach happened is it meant that even though we had to reduce water allocations eventually down to around 30% of what everybody had been accustomed to, the gross actually value of irrigated agricultural production only went down by 20%. You can see the brown line there and compare it with the blue line, the amount of reduction in water. But the amount of reduction in income went down much less because of the trading arrangements we put in place. And this is now cited as an example around the world of how important these arrangements can be should you go into a long drought of the type Australia's had. It's very important to plan for the worst, and this is what we've done. The key features that drove all of this were first adjudicating all of the water rights on a region-by-region basis and assembling them into a combined plan. We grandfathered in all existing users, tried to work out what they were entitled to do and gave them a share. We decided, importantly, to assign the entitlements, the shares, to individuals, not to districts. In the old regime, districts were very protective. We moved away from that and said there had to be an opportunity to trade water out of one region into another. Doing that would prove to be very, very important, and it drove a lot of improvement in water management in each irrigation district. And particularly the costs of supplying water went down, which meant that actually the entire regions became much more prosperous and much more wealthy. We established markets in shares and water allocations. It's now possible, for example, to trade water from Victoria through into the state where I live in South Australia inside 2 days. We've moved to a very, very rapid process. We assigned 100% of the supply risk to the shareholders, to water users, and required them to plan for uncertainty. That's been very, very important. We took away all requirements on use. We used to have, as you do still in Texas, a use it or use it, lose it policy. By having a use it or lose it policy, what we discovered was people used it inefficiently and didn't invest in savings. When we took that simple requirement away, people invested in water use, made savings, and as a result, and also the unbundling systems we put in place, they rapidly started to innovate. We limited the number of security pools to high, general and low security, and we made everything as fungible as possible, as tradable as possible. Importantly, we guaranteed all of the share registers. The state government guaranteed their integrity and made the shares mortgageable. Banks became very interested and started being very keen to lend money to irrigators and others who held water entitlements. We got the politicians and lawyers and administrators out of the ongoing adjustment process by appointing an independent Murray-Darling Basin authority and bringing discipline, so that when people wanted to go to the courts, they could only go to courts about the plans, not about the day-to-day rules around trading. That proved to be very, very important. Same time, we went to full cost charging for infrastructure management and water supply, corporatised the supply and delivery services and gave ownership of those companies to the shareholders. They started improving the management, and it led to some major changes. As I've said, same time all this was happening, we started issuing shares to the environment so that environmental managers became an equal player. We now have an arrangement where the environment always receives an allocation at the same time as everybody else does, and as a result of this, our environmental water managers now have a water budget. They have to make decisions about when and how to use water. And it's interesting to see when there's a flood or a small rainfall event, to see them sit down and discuss how to release the water, how long to have it sit, and so forth. We've also moved to setting up a salinity management market, which has proved to be equally effective. The environmental trusts that we've set up now hold a massive amount of water. We talk about gigalitres, but the plan when this whole process is finished is that they will end up holding about 1/3 of all of the shares in the Murray-Darling Basin. And they'll be there as a major water management manager, and as we're already discovering, they're sitting down to talk about how to get more environment per drop in the same way as our irrigators are talking about more crop per drop. And it's been very interesting to see the innovation and how environmental water managers are sometimes discovering that it's smart to sell water allocations back to the irrigation sector and use the money they receive to invest in other things that are important if you're interested in getting more environment per drop, rather than just sitting there in the old regime we used to have where they just sat and complained. They're now active managers and are focused on trying to improve the environment. So I guess in terms of moving forward, I'd like to float the question, is Texas missing an opportunity? When I look at the current allocation regime you have, it's essentially designed for another area. Australian experience suggests that if you invest in a state of environment or state-of-the-art regime, you can get significant returns, the environment can be improved, or water users become wealthier and communities become wealthier. I think it's possible to conceive that you could build a new regime that sat alongside the old one and allow people to voluntarily move from the old to the new regime. We've done this in some parts of Australia and it's proved to be incredibly successful. It would require you to write new legislation, to be very progressive in terms of setting up some trials on some well-chosen systems, rather than doing all of Australia, all of the state at one time as Australia did. I think it'd be much wiser to go in region by region and develop new water sharing plans in a few areas, convert over by setting up environment shares, allow voluntary conversion. As part of that, I imagine that something like all all rights before 1900 as part of the adjudication process would be converted into high security shares, say something like 1990 water to 1995 water to go to general security, and everything after that from say 1994 to go into low security shares. And by doing that you have systems that are robust, that are fully defined and easily traded. I could go on talking about this at great length, but I think it's wiser that I stop, open this up for others to comment. If you want to hear more about this, you can go to the YouTube address that's there and also look at my Droplet series, which is on the web. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. That was really interesting. I hope that everyone has been making note of their questions in the control panel to the right. I know that we, sitting in the room here at National Wildlife Federation in Austin, have written down at least a half dozen ourselves. So we're really looking forward to the question and answer period. Next, we're going to hear from Jennifer Ellis with National Wildlife Federation. She is going to bring this back to Texas and talk a little bit about solutions that we're looking at here. Take it away, Jennifer.
Okay, thanks very much, Jennifer. Well, I think Professor Young's presentation has really provided some very meaningful food for thought, determining that the current Australian system wasn't working, and that it was too broken to fix it, and that it was instead better to start from scratch was a really ambitious undertaking. And I think Mike and his fellow countrymen deserve significant recognition that for their vision and determination. I'm sure it was a lot of hard work to make that happen. So now I want to turn eyes to Texas and take a look at some of the things that are happening here in Texas, some of the opportunities we have in Texas. I guess the question is our system so flawed or broken that we can't fix it piece by piece? And do we need to think about a total overhaul of the water rights system in Texas? Is that something that could be in our future? Well, perhaps so, perhaps not. That may well depend on the severity of the future droughts or even the current drought. Certainly it was the drought in Australia and the rapidly changing circumstances that pushed them to act. And we certainly have seen drought hit home very hard here in Texas too. So that may be something we might talk about or consider for in the future, but what about in the shorter term? What can we do right now to move forward on keeping Texas's rivers flowing and keeping our bays healthy by allowing the rivers that deliver the freshwater inflows they need? And speaking very big picture, we have to figure out how to have water rights for the environment. We certainly have some environmental flow protection tools in place and that we use, such as putting limits on new water rights that are given out or permit conditions that are issued by the state to leave some flow in the river. And although those environmental flow conditions on new permits are certainly a very valuable tool and means of protecting flow, this in and of itself just simply isn't enough. We know that in Texas our river systems are already over appropriated and that those alone won't provide sufficient protection. And I know that Myron showed you this slide, I think it was in the first webinar, maybe the second, that kind of brings that point home. And for those of you that are new with us today, I just wanted to put it back up and show, because I think it provides some insight into why we have the situation that we do in Texas. As you can see, environmental flow conditions were only begun to be put on permits starting in 1985. And the vast majority of permits that were issued by the state were given out prior to that time. And so therefore, although we do have permit conditions on some permits, there's an awful lot that are out there that don't have any environmental flow conditions on them. So what are the strategies that we have to meet environmental flow needs? I know that we have, over the last two webinars that we've put on, have talked about several of the items that we have available to us here in Texas and that are in some ways being used. Certainly the purchase of water rights is something that we've talked quite a bit about, and we've talked about where it's being done in other parts of the country and also in other countries. Leases or dry year options are something certainly that we heard from Russ Snitcher with Drought Unlimited, talk quite a bit about the possibility of doing leases and dry year options. Conservation is certainly an important piece of the pie too. The dedication of return flows and looking at whether we can work to have some return flows dedicated for environmental purposes specifically, such as was done in Houston. And land stewardship, certainly a very important topic about how we can work to provide incentives to help landowners do things on the land that help then protect or provide additional quality and quantity of flow in our river systems. And one that I realized as I was flipping through this that I forgot to put on here that Brian Richter would kill me if he knew I forgot is, of course, dam reoperation. This is by no means a complete list, but certainly some of the biggies. And then, of course, rights donation is something that we're going to talk a little bit more about today. I'm going to get a little bit more in depth on. This is certainly something that we would like to see more of happen in the state, where people that have a water right that they are perhaps not using or not using a portion of, that they might dedicate a right to environmental flow purposes. So that brings me to a couple things that are not really strategies in and of themselves, but they are critically important things that we need to focus on. They're really critical components that are happening right now in the state of Texas, and that's what makes them really an important topic for today, I think. The first is the Restore Act, and the Restore Act, for those of you that may or not be familiar with it, is funds that will be coming to Texas as a result of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and we are very much focused on working to ensure that Restore Act funds that come to Texas are spent on ecological restoration. And we believe very fully that the estuaries, I know we haven't talked a lot about estuaries in this series, but this is a really important component. I know we talk about keeping rivers flowing, but one critical piece of why we want to keep rivers flowing is to keep them flowing to the bays. There's no more critical thing for bay health and bay productivity than having sufficient freshwater inflows getting to our bays. So how do we do that? How do we make sure that, that we're getting sufficient flows there? The Restore Act is one thing that provides us some opportunity to be able to actually acquire water rights and ensure that those water rights and that flow is then delivered to the bay to secure sufficient freshwater inflows. So a really important thing that will be coming down the pipe. And then the second item that I want to talk about, the second tool that we have available to us that we want to make sure that we're making good use of is the Texas Water Trust. And Myron touched on this a little bit in the last webinar and talked about a little bit about what the Water Trust is and what it isn't. Basically, the Water Trust was created in 1997 for the express purpose of holding water rights that are dedicated to environmental flow protection, which is a great thing. The downside is that there really hasn't been much activity. There are 3 rights that are currently in there, with the most recent being deposited 8 years ago. So most people don't know that the Water Trust exists, what it is, how it works, and we need to change that. And currently there is an interim House of Natural Resources interim committee charge, that's a mouthful, I hope I said that in the right order, that they are looking at the Water Trust and whether the Water Trust should be reconfigured in any way or whether new legislation should be considered related to that. And you know, there are several things that we could do to really improve upon the Water Trust. The first would be providing incentives to donate to the Water Trust. We want to make sure that when somebody is considering donating a right to the water trust, that there aren't hurdles in the way of making that happen that would be a disincentive. So things like making sure that the costs are waived or covered for things like mailing notices, putting notice in the newspaper, preparing applications, the filing fees, things like that. We should really look at whether we can work to have those costs taken out of the equation for a donor. Another thing that we can do is look at whether we can make perpetual donations tax deductible. That would certainly provide an incentive to people that are interested in the possibility of donating if they were able to do that. Something else we might consider is whether or not Texas Parks and Wildlife might be a good fit for having, whether it might make more sense for Parks and Wildlife to have a more robust role associated with the Water Trust. Right now, the Water Trust is housed at the Texas Water Development Board, and although the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department does have some role as far as the Water Trust, more specifically, they have the role of, well, sorry, hold on, let me go back. The Water Development Board does, I'm sorry, the Texas Parks and Wildlife does have the role of enforcing water rights that are in the Water Trust currently, and we could build on that role to make it a little bit more robust. The agency's charge is to manage and conserve the natural and cultural resources of Texas and to provide hunting, fishing, and outdoor recreation opportunities for the use and enjoyment of present and future generations. And it seems to me that that's a very good fit for managing environmental flows for the environment. And they certainly have things like staff on board and a structure in place that could perform most of the work needed to convert water rights to environmental flow uses, moving them through the donation process. They have the legal expertise, they have prior experience with donation, and things like that would make it a good fit. And of course, they also have existing relationships with landowners, and this would be, I think, a critically important role. Because of their work with, because of their wildlife biologists, their game wardens, their conservation programs that they have working on the ground with landowners, they certainly would be able to play a more active role in talking to folks about the Water Trust and that possibility. And definitely significant outreach will be needed. That's another important thing that we're going to need to look at how to expand that so that people know that this trust exists and that they can donate funds to it, donate rights to it. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot one very important thing there that's on the very bottom of the list, which is funding. Of course, nothing happens without funding, right? So substantial money would be needed to support having a robust water trust that would be highly functional. Certainly something to support some portion of staff salaries and outreach, any analysis and notices. Something maybe in the realm of $600,000 a biennium might be a ballpark number that would be worth considering for something like that. And I should mention that as we speak, the reason that you're stuck with me instead of hearing from Myron Hess, Jennifer didn't mention this, but Myron is actually currently over at the House of Natural Resources Interim Committee hearing, where they're receiving testimony on charge number 3, which is the combination of land stewardship, the Texas Water Trust, and oh my gosh, what's the third thing? I just spaced out. Oh, and groundwater is the third item. And so that's why you're hearing from me today instead of Myron. And I would certainly, they are doing a video broadcast of that. I don't know, it's always a little bit of a wild card what time they may or may not be coming on, but I will put up at the end of my presentation here the web link that you can go to get to the video broadcast. And see what's left, if you have any bandwidth left at that point, anyway. Okay, so moving on to what can we do? What are some of the things that we can take action on today to move forward as far as getting some environmental flows rights that are dedicated to environmental flow. Certainly, if you are somebody who owns a water right and you're maybe not using it or interested in doing something proactive for the environment, donating a water right to the Water Trust would be a great way to do it. The Water Trust isn't perfect, but it certainly is there and is functional, and you could make the call tomorrow or even later today. You can also contact your Texas State representatives and Texas State Senator, the Natural Resource Committee members, and ask for some of these things that I've mentioned today, some of these types of improvements in the Water Trust. Ask for water rights for the environment. Express your interest in making sure that we're keeping rivers flowing in Texas and moving forward on some of these strategies. Using restore funds for water rights acquisition. This is something else that you could mention to your decision makers that's an important piece of input. And then, of course, something that we can all do in our everyday life is make the most efficient use of existing supplies. And that can be both the big picture, making the most efficient use of existing supplies. So, for example, when we're considering issuing new water rights for a water right project, we would want to make sure that the permittee is making the most efficient use of existing water supplies first in a meaningful way. So there's kind of big picture things like this. There's, of course, House Bill 4, which is ongoing, as far as looking at how we make sure that we are putting funding towards conservation programs. And then there's things that we can do in our daily lives, at home, at work, at school, to ensure the most efficient use. Okay, and I wanted to just share a personal story with you all, if you can tolerate it. I hope you can. This is my daughter, Gwen. She's doing one of the things that she does best, which is wrangling minnows. This is at Guadalupe State Park, where my husband and I recently took our two young daughters to camp for in this last fall. It's one of my favorite places to go camping. And as I mentioned, it was fall, and the bald cypress trees were all changing color. They were just at the peak of their color, just absolutely beautiful. And my older daughter, who's 7, had climbed up on a fallen log, and she was looking out over the water at the river's edge. And she stood still there, really overlooking the cliffs and the colors and the trees and the flowing river. And after a long pause, she said, with almost a gasp, "Mom, it is just so beautiful here. I feel like I need to come back here really often. And I feel like if I don't, I'll die younger." Out of the mouth of babes. It's moments like that that make me again recognize how very important this task is, that it isn't just about maintaining the natural systems because of what they provide for our physical selves, but it's also about providing fuel for the soul. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Jennifer Walker. Thank you very much for your time and attention today. As I mentioned, the Natural Resources video broadcast website here is up on the bottom of the slide.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer. You covered a lot of material, and there's so much that we can do to help rivers in Texas. We've got a lot of options, and it's going to take work on all levels. We've got all kinds of folks on the webinar today, policymakers, folks that study environmental flows, interested citizens, so we can all work together to move forward. So we're going to go ahead and start the Q&A section now. We've had several questions come in, and we need to unmute Mike. Okay, we've got Mike unmuted. Are you out there, Mike?
Yes, I am.
Oh, hello. So we're going to leave you with some beautiful pictures of rivers to look at here, and Mike is on the screen. Hopefully you all can see him. Hello.
Hi, wearing a headset so I can talk more clearly. Apologies for that.
Excellent. So we're going to go ahead, and Laura Parchman from the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment, which is one of the co-sponsors of our webinar series, is going to moderate the question and answer period. So we will let Laura take over here for the next few minutes.
Good afternoon. Mike, this question is for you, and it is about the political backlash that happened when you guys first introduced this system and how it was overcome.
It's interesting if you go through the history. The first bit, when we essentially closed the systems or adjudicated it, there was tremendous political support for that. Everybody was interested in moving to the new regime. Very quickly as we started trading, there were a lot of people who were opposed at the early stages, but once they realized that every 5 years the value of their holdings, this is what they currently held, was doubled and then doubled again, they became much more concerned about the planning detail. There was a time, which is often talked about internationally, when the first exposure draft of the new plan for the Murray-Darling was released, that a whole pile of people burnt copies of the plan in front of TV stations and everything. But ultimately, all that was put to bed, and now we have a much more robust system. So it's been an interesting journey. We learned a lot about community consultation, about leadership and negotiation, sharing visions. But I can assure you that today nobody would go back to the old regime. They wouldn't dream of it, because it's created so much wealth, so much environmental improvement, and so many opportunities to do things much more smartly than we've done it before. I think the most interesting thing was, I used to think and dream about going to Israel to find out how to manage water. I don't have to do that anymore in Australia. Everybody comes to Australia now, so we get lots of Israelis, lots of Egyptians, lots of Americans coming to find out how to manage water, and that's been really comforting for everybody.
And another question for you, Mike. If the environment is given shares at the time of conversion, did the owners demand compensation for those shares, and how was the compensation funded?
A large proportion of the shares given to the environment were purchased. They were purchased through a tender process at market value, with funding from the government largely. But in some other systems, such as in Victoria, when we adjudicated the basins and closed them off so there would be no more rights issued, there was still some water available that hadn't been allocated, and we gave part of that to the environment and part of that to all the existing users. So they were compensated by being granted a larger slice of water. The other thing which was very important is, as we took restrictions off use and let people decide not to use water, that created lots of innovation and lots of opportunity. So it was win-win all around.
Thank you. And another question, how have those holding environmental flow shares in Australia managed those shares in relation to the variable flow regimes needed for the environmental flows?
It was really interesting. Once you have a share system and you have allocations that can only be made to shareholders, the environment has water that's held in dams until the environmental manager decides to use it, and that's done in a very variable framework. And what's interesting now is to see the environmental trusts of the sort that Jennifer was talking about making decisions. A really good example is up in our Guida system, where there is a water account that's maintained to save water so that when there's a bird breeding event in the Macquarie marshes, the managers release just enough water down into the system to ensure that whenever birds start breeding, that the birds can breed through to maturity and fly away. That's the sort of thing we're seeing, is very, very conscious management of variability. And Australia has one of the most variable climates in the world. So that's just part of what we do, and it's the reason why we have now environmental water accounts and environmental water managers who are, interestingly, sitting down talking to irrigators and starting to use things like soil moisture probes so they understand the science and the state-of-the-art in water management, so they can get maximum gain from the water that's allocated to them.
Thank you. I'm going to toss out a question to Jennifer now. We have a question concerning, how do you target water rights for the water trust to maximize environmental benefit?
Well, that's a very good question, and certainly that's something that's been the topic of a lot of discussion about whether you look at seniority. Obviously, seniority is an important aspect for any water right as far as whether or not you can rely on that water and to what extent. Certainly location for environmental purposes, this is a big one. Because we don't have yet a system in place where we can essentially dedicate flow downstream, we need to look at placement to some extent of where the water right is, or we need to also at the same time be working on figuring out how do we alter a water right in order to put the dedication point downstream in a meaningful way so that that flow can't simply be removed. You know, if a new water right holder, for example, applied for a right immediately below the point of where somebody had dedicated a right, they could essentially just divert that water out of the stream. So we need to find a way to meaningfully dedicate the water downstream. And certainly, you know, do you have a willing seller? This is something that, you know, we keep coming back around to that, or somebody who's willing to donate. That is really, that trumps all, doesn't it? Because if you don't have somebody that's willing to donate, you can't, you know, that's just a non-starter. So you really have to look at lots of different pieces of the pie. You know, certainly if you had people rushing the door wanting to donate their water rights, you might be able to look at some of these other things of seniority date, of you know, of location, things like that, of use, and begin to think about a second level of prioritization. But really it comes down to, do you have a willing donor?
Thank you.
Can I just actually cut in there? It's interesting that you say that, because what we did in Australia is we said there'll only be 3 types of right. There'll be senior, sort of average, and then junior rights. And we put into plans the exchange rate rules for when you move water from one location to the other, and sorted all that out. So as a result of that, you don't have to manage exactly where water's held, because everybody has the same share of the system, and it's just a matter of looking up the tables to work out how much water you get at each location. It's a much simpler system. It enables people to spend all their time and effort managing rather than trying to run complex administrative processes which just gobble up time and resources to the gain of nobody. And that's why our actually systems are so much more productive. The money goes into management and improvement rather than into complex legal processes.
Mike, if I could, I'm curious as to how it was decided to make whether you were in the top tier, the middle tier, or the bottom tier as far as seniority. Was that based on something prior, or based on the use, or what?
Based on essentially history, which you could do, as I've said, if you have very senior rights, you know who all the senior rights are. So rather than having, say, 1,000 different senior rights, we converted them all into shares in a senior right pool. And what we did is we worked out how many shares you would get when you converted from the old system into the new system. But once you're in that, you're an equal senior shareholder or a junior shareholder, wherever you are in the system. Once you have 3 shares or 3 types of shares, then when somebody buys and sells a share, you don't have to worry about all the third-party problems that you still have in your system. So we can transfer shares for $100 from one location or from one person to another. It's not a big deal. Banks mortgage them, love doing so because they're so valuable and so easy to move. If you want to lease a share to somebody 1,000 miles away, no problems, you do it tomorrow. And there's no need to have any argument because a share is a share is a share. It's simple, and it works incredibly well.
Mike, another question for you. Can you provide us an example how the environment has improved due to the new system and how the environmental manager is maximizing the system?
Yeah, in fact, the people who developed all of the early thinking around trading around the area of Kerrang had massive salinity problems. and their water wasn't worth very much at all because the salt was eating away at their profits and the crops that they could grow and the pastures they could grow. What they did initially was to sell off their water rights to people in other parts of Victoria who, in the same state, started planting grapes and making a lot more money. So they received about 5 times the value of what their water was worth to them when they sold it.